Welcome to another episode of the Swarm Chatter Podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Gnozim. Check out their new catalog for the upcoming winter event, which will take place Sunday, February 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. As always, they have many amazing items, including a first edition of the Mesilas Yesharim, manuscript letter of the Ramchal, the handwritten will of the Chavetz Chaim, and many more items. You can check out the catalog at Gnozim, GENAZYM.com. You can also check out the Auction Chatter episode discussed here on the podcast for more information. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by Unlocking Lashon HaKodesh, published by Mosaic Press, a guide to the Hebrew language. So this was something that last week's episode on the podcast discussed. So again, for more information, listen to that. And I've gotten very good feedback, so I do urge you to listen to that if you didn't listen to that. It was published by Professor Eliezer Lewis Glenert. And as the book subtitle says, a guide to the Hebrew language, it really is a guide that really breaks down Diktuk and walks you through Hebrew grammar or Lashon Kodesh, and something that Diktuk is kind of a scary thing to us all, as we discussed on that podcast episode. But this book really, in English, really from the best things that exists, really breaks it down and explains it in a clear manner, and you can understand and pick it up. And there's an index and more information in the book that makes it helpful and usable for everyone. So check out the link in the show notes. You can purchase Unlocking Lashon Kodesh from Mosaic Press. Use code CHATTER, CHATTER, for 15% off. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast in any way, please email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com. You can also email me or WhatsApp me as well if you have guest suggestions or topic suggestions for future podcast episodes. You can also find the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarm Chatter WhatsApp community or WhatsApp status, where I post new books, new Svarm, book deals, and so on. And finally, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, and enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Swarm Chatter Podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Emile Schrijver, who is the General Director of the Jewish Cultural Quarter in Amsterdam, as well as a Professor of Jewish Book History at the University of Amsterdam, and the Curator of the Braginski Collection in Zurich, Switzerland. And he also was the co-author of the book that we'll be discussing here on the podcast, Fables in Jewish Culture, the John A. Linseth Collection. And he actually wrote this catalog, so we'll be discussing Jewish fables. And thank you, Professor Schrijver, for joining me once again.
My pleasure.
So how do we define Jewish fables?
Well, it's not necessarily an easy topic, because fables as such are not a typically Jewish genre, but they do appear all over Jewish literature, frankly. I mean, as early as as Tanakh. I mean, so we have a number of fables in Tanakh, but typically most of us connect them to the Fox fables, and most of us connect them to the let's say the later genres, but they're a lot older. And the way that I define them, and in the book, and we define them in the book, we actually discuss a number of definitions, is a story that takes place in the world of animals, plants, or inanimate objects, told in the past tense, but applied to the present, that contains a moral lesson. Does that mean that it needs what we know from let's say, non-Jewish fables, that toward the end the fable will tell you what you can learn? No, not necessarily. I mean, it's important for us to keep that in mind. So it has to take place in the world of animals, plants, or inanimate objects. It should be told in past tense, and it should be applied to the present with a moral lesson. So how does that compare to it's called mashal in Hebrew, but mashal is a word that we also use for parable. And and we use it especially for the rabbinic parable, but I mean we have defined fable as a separate genre, and the form in itself, that let's say the way that the fable is being presented is of less importance to us than this particular notion that I've just told you. So is it tricky? Of course it's tricky. I mean, this collection is a collection of a private collector, and it's not a collection of an academic institution. It's not a collection of a Jewish institution. It's a non-Jewish collector, and he's been collecting fables for all of his life. Any book containing a fable is considered of importance to the Linseth collection. So in a way, what he's been collecting, and I was not involved in the collecting process as such. The collecting process was the majority of the collecting took place before I got involved at the end of the last century, actually. So first time I visited him back in in Hunting Valley, Ohio, near Cleveland, is 1998. So that took me forever took us forever to finish the book. So some of the books that he collected, we decided not to include. Some of the books that I would perhaps not have included, we decided to include after all.
So it's interesting you say fable, you use the Hebrew word mashal, but listeners are probably familiar with Mishalim, the classical, like you said, the classical parable, or Mishalim, Dubna Magid, Mishalim. Yeah. That's not what we're referring to here, though, when we say Jewish fables.
It's not it's not only what we refer to. So believe me, Dubno is in there. There's all of them are in there, and all our famous Mishalim are in there. And but what, let's say, the way that we know from Talmud, from Midrash, the notion of a mashal is not enough for us. I mean, it has to contain the animals, plants, inanimate objects, and it has to contain a moral lesson. And that's different from a majority. In Jewish tradition, it's at the end of the day, it's more of an exegetical procedure, and for us, it's a narrative thing. So it has to tell the story, and the story has to be told in the past. I think that is so also the element of story is very important, because the typical mashal that we know from rabbinic literature is not necessarily a story; it's a comparison. And the comparison is not enough. So that I think that at the end of it makes it's a literary approach to a corpus that the Jews themselves, certainly in the past, have not necessarily defined as a literary genre. That is the interesting thing. So it was believe me, I mean, I wrote a 10-page introduction which will not read out in full, just on the issue of definition. And so it's difficult enough to define it, but I decided to keep it open for especially for there are many others. I mean, Yassiv has worked. Eli Yassiv from Israel has worked on the definition. It's a slightly different notion, but I also had to work with a collection that needed description. So practicality was part of the deal.
Right. The book contains a number of articles about Jewish fables, and then there is the whole collection where you list out the collection with pictures, color pictures of each item, and it's a collection. So it's a very interesting book. And so, like you're saying, you have to, on the one hand, discuss fables, Jewish fables, that is, but also deal with the collection. So let's talk a little bit more about fables and the popularity of fables today. I don't know how popular they are today as something that it used to be extremely popular, especially you already mentioned. We'll get into Mishlei Shualim and Mashal HaKadmoni and all these old classical works of the Rishonim, medieval Jewish literature. But how popular were Jewish fables? And maybe even just take a step back, and in general, in even the non-Jewish world, fables, how popular fables were at one point, and then how that carried over to the Jewish tradition.
Well, I think that as if you want to explain something to someone, very generally, if you want to explain something to someone, our minds are made up in such a way that we can make connections between things happening. This is what mashal works as an exegetical thing, but I think at the end of the day that the fable it serves a moral lesson, but it has always been popular in teaching. And it remains to be popular in teaching. And that doesn't necessarily mean to children, but teaching and just the exchange of ideas between people. And it's a slightly more playful, but it can also be a very critical, but a slightly more playful approach to explaining tradition, to explaining notions, to explaining intellectual notions. And it's also, and that is a big difference, it's also just a pleasure to read. I mean, it's literature, so people take pleasure in reading it. They can be very beautiful. They can be very smart. They can be very problematic and pose questions that are very hard to answer. But in general, they're a genre that people like to listen to. We all like to listen to genre. So there's this famous saying: you can't. You can't dance at two weddings, so you can't be at the same place at the same time, and play two different places at the same time. And so you have to choose between the one occasion that you want to visit and the other occasion that you want to visit. There's a beautiful fable. I do it from the top of my head. I can't mention the fable, but I know there's different versions of it, where a dog knows that after a Jewish wedding there will always be food left, and in order to and in trying to be at the end of both weddings, he misses out on both of them. So if you combine it to the so there's no food whatsoever. So the fable is about greed. The fable is about the notion that you have to make choices. But we like to hear a story about the dog. So it's a different way of telling a story, and it's a way of making the moral content of a story more accessible to the general listener/reader.
Right, and like I said, this was something that was very popular in medieval literature, Yiddish literature, and Haskalah also. This is something that's discussed in the various articles in here. So let's go talk about early Jewish fables, the ones that are early, and as well as, and I mentioned Mashal Kamoni, Mishlei Shualim, and then there's also Ben HaMelech Nazir. These are books that were printed and reprinted many times. These were quite famous at some point. We're not going to, we can spend a full podcast episode on all of those, but just to give an overview or discuss those, those are especially, let's call those the three most famous ones for those that maybe are familiar or aren't familiar, to at least give an example, like an idea of what those are.
Well, if we take Ben HaMelech Nazir, and Ben HaMelech Nazir, and I think it's the easiest way is actually if we read out just the first paragraph from my intro there, because that tells exactly what it is. Ben HaMelech Nazir, The Prince and the Hermit, is a didactic work. That's where we go again. Didactic work. It's about teaching, in which a prince becomes an ascetic. It was translated and adapted from an unknown Arabic version into Hebrew by the 13th century scholar Abraham Shmuel ibn Chisdai. That's also very important. It's an interaction between culture. It is an adaptation to the Jewish content of a more generic, be it Christian in a later period of time, be it Russian or Western European, be it whatever. I mean, in this particular case, in the medieval period in Sfarad, it's logical that it would be Arabic. It's translated into Hebrew and adapted to the Jewish. Then Greek, Latin, and modern European versions are generally known as Balaam and Yosafat. The work originated in India, and the prince is Gautama Buddha, the founder of Buddhism. So you can see how it's interreligious. The Hebrew version exists in 24 manuscripts, 14 of which dated before 1500, and was printed more than 30 times, as you already indicated. The story relates how Yoasav, a prince eager for knowledge, and which is, of course, a virtue, so it's also about teaching virtues, eager for knowledge, was fascinated by a meeting with a hermit who revealed to him the sorry plight of the world, convinced him to concentrate on God and his power and to reject earthly desires. This is also about ethics, and so it has an ethical content. The Hebrew version is written in the so-called Makama style, integrating poetry and rhyming prose. And the Makama, it's related to the word makom. It's a sort of a rhyming prose that was probably used for public reading. So it was a rhyming prose where you would typically have two presenters. Originally, it's not entirely clear, but this is the general explanation, where two presenters would tell a story, would go back and forth, and the rhyming would help to memorize it. And it's called the Makama style. The story relates how Yoasav, a prince eager for knowledge, was fascinated by a meeting with the hermit who revealed him the sorry plight of the world and convinced him to concentrate on God and his power and to reject earthly desires. So this is also about ethics. And the Hebrew version is written in the so-called Makama style, integrating poetry and rhyming prose, which is a reference to the way that many of these stories might have been presented in public, where you would have two presenters who would use the rhyming to alternate reading one verse after the other, and there's no meter, there's no rhythm in the sentence itself, there's only rhyming. So rhyming prose, and the last three chapters are written entirely in prose and discuss the human soul. And these seem to be the creation of Ibn Chisdai and are not found in the Arabic original. So it's very important to keep that in the back of our heads. All these fables that were taken from non-Jewish literature do need adaptation to the Jewish content. And our authors, especially in the medieval period, were very keen on giving them that Jewish content. So they were deliberately adapting these ancient fables to basically to what they wanted to teach about Judaism. And this is usually about the virtuous life. It's about modesty. It's about the regular themes that continue to be important in a religious life.
Again, Ben Melech was printed many times. Moshe Chagiz publishes an edition. I mean, it's printed and reprinted and reprinted again. I don't know today if you walk into the bookstore and buy these anymore. We talk about Mishlach Kadmoni, another one that was reprinted many times, actually translated to English. Again, I don't know if it's available anymore. Mishlei Shualim, Bracha and Akton. These were things that were the Fox Fables. Yeah. Maybe that's one of the most famous.
I think they're still available. I'm not sure that they're read that intensely. Let's put it that way. I think the interest has become more academic. But it would actually add to religious teaching if we would continue to use them. Frankly, I mean because it makes a big difference in the way that we manage to understand it. Mashallah Kadmoni is the same thing. But Mashallah Kadmoni is a very difficult text, so we shouldn't underestimate the depth of knowledge that is necessary to have a proper understanding of the text. But that does not mean. And certain books are more difficult. The fables are contained in all kinds of books that are more literary than religious. That's another thing. So the traditional collections of the medieval period, Mishlei Shoalim, that's what we all think about when we think about this as Berachia, Naktan, and it's the first independent collection of fables in Hebrew literature. So it's not fables contained in a book that has a different story, but it's meant to be an independent collection of fables, authored by Berachia Nagdan, who probably spent some time in England, France, and he must have. It's already 13th century, and so that's a very old. It's a very old text, and he was called Nagdan, so it's probably also involved in Melechet HaSofut in one way or the other, or at least as a scholar. Involved in the production of manuscripts, and he wanted to bring together all the knowledge contained. This is all oral tradition, and the orality of these stories. He wanted to put them together, and he made them into a separate work. And his work is printed over and over and over again. And John Lintus has managed to collect all these books, and they were also, even after they were collected as Jewish fables, even after they became part of the Jewish canon, so to speak, or at least of the Jewish of a Jewish literary tradition, the authors and editors continue to adapt them to the needs of their particular reading audiences, be that through translations, be that through editorial work, leaving out things that were not considered appropriate, or the other way around, adding things that were considered of particular importance, but were not part of the original work. So it's also in terms of understanding the way that these fables were transmitted throughout Judaism. It tells us a lot about the control that the rabbinic authorities and the intellectual elites wanted to have over what is being read by Jewish readership and what isn't. There's a fable in there. There's called The Wolf and the Animals, and the animals come to a lion to complain about the wolves who attacks and eats them all. And the lion admonishes the wolf and tells him to eat only dead meat from now on, and punishes him by forbidding him to eat meat at all for 2 years. The wolf swears that he will not, but after a while is overcome by a longing for meat. So he reasons to himself, night is when you close your eyes, and daytime is when you open them. He opens and closes his eyes one day, and he continues doing so until he counted 2 years. But this is smartness. This is a smart little thing. This is very easily used for teaching to people why it is wrong to bend a punishment towards your own needs. And this is the kind of thing you find there. So creative teachers and creative teaching actually, you can still use things like this. I mean, do we do it? No, we probably don't do it enough. But that's a result. Oh, we live in a different world. Let's put it that way.
Right, we do. These were, that's what I'm saying. These were so popular at one point, and they were printed over the centuries. If you see in this book, which I'll link to in the show notes, the Lindsay collection and the catalog, together with the articles that you published, really has, the Lindsay collection really has all these. You can see how many times it was printed and how many different places and locations, different little editions. It was in Yiddish, and you really see it. And also Mashal HaKadmaini. You talk about Mashal HaKadmaini. There's books that, and then there's this. As you mentioned, this is a collection that you came to catalog. So there's some that are a little, Tachkamuni. That's the Makama. That's a little different. I mean, it's not about animals so much, but there's those that include. I mean, there's so many of these works that, and then plenty of other ones that we're forgetting, and there are other translations. Other.
One of the interesting things that I found when I got there, I got this letter on 1998 from John Lindsay. I didn't know him. He came to know of me through Joseph Goldman, who was then the book dealer from Brooklyn and the psychoanalyst, and he was his most important agent for these books. After he saw in a non-Jewish book dealer pointed out to him the existence of Mashal HaKadmaini actually. So there was in a very early edition of Mashal HaKadmaini. He pointed it out to him in an auction. There's no Jewish book, and he started to ask himself, is there such a thing as a Jewish fable? And then he went around asking, and Joseph Goldman was the first who said, well, I'm not sure that there is. And then they started to communicate, and I'll talk about the early 1990s, and then suddenly Goldman understand what Lindsay meant. And he started to provide him with all these books, and he was the only one who did. So Lindsay then continued to buy in auctions and everything, typically with or without Goldman's involvement. But generally, it took a while for the market to understand the notion that a book can also be interesting simply for containing even one fable. This is how the man collected. Lindsay is interested in any book that contains a fable. So that can also be, in the Haskalah period, the journal Hamasev. Hamasev has a couple of dozens of fables included in the total run of a Haskalah journal over many years. So he will buy the print run. He will buy the run. So it is a book that contains one fable was enough reason for this collector to collect, and I think it's quite a unique proposition that we have a collection of Jewish books that is not collected based on let's say on content or on being illustrated or on being rabbinical works or on being a manuscript or a printed book. No, it's only based on a particular literary genre that has to be represented at least once inside this particular book.
Just in general, what was John Lindsay's interest in fables? I mean, he said he has a fable collection, and then he got to Jewish fables through that, right? But first, he was originally interested in fables generally.
Fables. Well, first of all he has the most important American collection of Lewis Carroll. So they will actually, they will end up in England, probably where they belong. So it's the largest collection of anything related to Lewis Carroll. He used to have a collection of suffragette literature, different, but he collected Russian fables as well. And as is typical in the U.S., you know that as well. I mean, he wanted to donate his book to his alma mater. So he studied at Cornell. So his idea was, I collect an enormous number of books. He's interested generally in the imaginative literature that is of a different character than let's say the highbrow literature, which is, well, if you take an interest in Lewis Carroll, if you take an interest in Alice in Wonderland, it makes sense for you to also be interested in fable literature. So this is the kind of thing that triggered him. He was also very much interested, he is until today, he's over 90 now, he's until today in the different languages, in the notion of translation. He has a wonderful book in which he invited dozens and dozens and dozens of scholars to translate one particular passage of Alice into their language and translating it back into English, and seeing what happens to the translation. So he's clearly interested in the notion of translation and in the notion of many different languages. One of the things that I remember in many of the discussions that I had with him is a thing that he taught me. I think it's not his. I think it's actually, if I'm not wrong, it may even be Max Weinreich who said that. But he said, language is a dialect with a flag, which is a very nice way to put it. So he has a fascination in this. He has a fascination for the for this particular literary genre. And what do I know? I mean, he collected it. He took care of the books very well. And at a certain point toward the end of the 1990s, he invited me to write this catalog. And the catalog was meant to be, once the catalog was finished, the books would be presented as a gift to Cornell University, and which is where they are now.
But yet you decided to publish the catalog. So it's published. You can, as any catalog, it's got pictures and color of each item together with a short description and then an explanation, a little bit, short write-up on the books, as well as a collection of articles in the beginning. Why did you decide to go that route and to publish the book for the wider general public if they're interested?
Well, I initially wanted to do a shorter catalog, and a catalog that was a catalog that just had proper descriptions and a short description of the content. But in the development of the work, we decided that we would do more elaborate descriptions, the very detailed descriptions of the books themselves. Also, I can tell you that was in many cases it was a nightmare, because for the early books this is typically available, but for the later books it's not available. So we worked very, very hard on that level of detail. He, at a certain point, involved a non-Jewish book collector who knows his Hebrew quite well, by the name of Jay Dillon. He's a Monmouth, and Jay Dillon added a lot of detail to the descriptions, or demanded me that I add a lot of detail to the descriptions, and at the same time, we decided if the collection principle for this collection is fables, we should concentrate on the fable content. So we have the translation of at least one fable per book. Because otherwise, why would we want to? It would not be clear why he would have bought it. So we count the number of fables inside the book, and we translate at least one fable inside the book, and we provide the reader with all the bibliographical detail that is necessary to define the book. And we worked extremely hard on identifying other copies, which of course is also important to get a notion of the rarity of a particular copy. And I can tell you there's as is typical for bibliographies, a lot of work has gone into the sections of the descriptions nobody will read. This is the way it is.
As always, yeah. Unless someone's looking for it, they're never gonna that specific book. Forget about it.
Exactly. So it's so that's what's going on. But I must say that overall, if you go through the book and you've been reading through the book, if you leaf through the book, there's all kinds of little tidbits of information that are really of big interest, and you get as far as I know, this is really the only case that we have where the literary content of Jewish books defines a collection, and as such, it teaches us the variety of languages, the variety of genres that is available in Jewish literature, not only Hebrew.
So perhaps you want to give one or two or three examples, but also another thing that we should highlight that I mentioned, but we talked about the medieval ones, Ben HaMelech VaNazir, Mashal HaKadmonim, Mishle Shualim, and again, there's much more to talk about those than we're just doing here in a few minutes. But then you also have in Yiddish, but there's so much Haskalah literature in the Haskalah, and you can read in Bikuri Itim, in Hamasef, in looking at Benan Urim from Gateless. I mean, it's extensive. You can look through. There's pages and pages and pages of Maskilim publishing Mishalim. So what do you these fables, if you will? Why were the Maskilim and the Haskalah so interested in fables? Was that something that surprised you when you went into this, looking at this and seeing how much there was, how many fables there were during the Haskalah period?
Yes and no. We have to realize that ethics is something that was of great importance to many of these Maskilim. So and these fables teach a moral lesson. They were also very well versed in non-Jewish literature, and they were living in a time in which German literature fables were also very, very popular. In which in Russian literature fables were also very popular. And so in which if in the period in which in the languages that they were also using, fables were very common. And in order for them to and one of their goals was to also, well, what was going on later on also in Wissenschaft des Judentums. One of the goals of these scholars was really to give Jewish literature its place in the literature of the world, which was also one of the goals also of the Maskilim, then well, it was logical they would concentrate on fables. The other thing is that strategy was always about teaching, and fables were generally Jewish and non-Jewish in that particular time, late 18th century, 19th century, particularly popular in teaching. So yes, it was a surprise to see the number, and yes, it was a surprise to see the just in a journal like Hamas and like a couple of the others, to see the extent to which these things were common. I was most surprised by the ease with which many non-Jewish fables got translated. I mean, the most important example is Krylov. Krylov was so Ivan Andreevich Krylov, and he lived from 1769 to till 1844, and he has a variety of collections of fables, and they were translated from the Russian into the Hebrew. And why? Well, probably because the majority of Jewish readers appreciated the Hebrew more. Also because they felt that the quality of the fables apparently was such that they were important for the Jewish reader to be aware of. So it was for example, the first person to translate the Krylov fables, and Krylov is a very, very famous Russian author. The first to publish them from the original Russian into Hebrew was Schrijver, born in Vilnius, Hebrew author, grammarian, and moved to New York, and where he worked as a Hebrew school teacher. And he published. So he was inspired to learn different languages, Russian, German, French, by a Gentile teacher who was a regular customer in his father's tavern. And he studied together with Judah Leib Gordon. And Judah Leib Gordon was one of the most important fable poets in Hebrew literature. And he was aware of the fact that the Jews already knew the genre. He describes that the fables already appeared in the Bible and that they already appeared in Talmud. And he claims actually that the fable itself is of Jewish origin, which is let's call it a chauvinistic point. I think it's very important very difficult to prove it. And he again underscores the importance of fables for the education of children. So it was always about education. And it was also a way, he said, to understand the Russian language, because he followed the Russian line by line. So so he also assumed that people would actually try to understand the Russian better based on the Hebrew. And this is, of course, all about the Haskalah. It's about a constant back and forth between keeping the Jewish content in place, and at the same time being in touch with the surrounding cultures.
And you mentioned fables, so we talked about Mishle Shulam before. There's Mishle Shulam has Mishalim and fables from Gemara. It also has from plenty of other sources as well, and Bracha and Akton, and he's quoting from there's all different fables, and like you say, what's nice about in the cataloging itself, you do bring down translation of fables, so you can get, it's not only reading like a boring, for those that are familiar with reading with cataloging, while important, it can be just a formulaic list of just, this is where it was printed, this is who wrote it, this is who published it. No, there's actually a little bit about the content, and then, there is an example of a fable. You can read about Mishle Shulam, you talk about the wolf and the animals, which the animals come to the lion to complain about the wolf who attacks and eats them all. The lion admonishes the wolf, and he tells him to eat only dead meat from now on, and punishes him by forbidding him to eat meat for 2 years. The wolf swears that he will not, but after a while he's overcome by a longing for the meat. He reasons himself, night is when you close your eyes, and daytime when you open them. He opens and closes his eyes one day, and he continues doing so until he counts 2 years. He says, it's 2 years, I can eat meat now. And he goes to eat the meat, and he goes on, and you can read the mashal, and you should read the Mishalim. Another one, there's some interesting ones to jump later on. You have one is the Vikuach Hayayin, which is number 141, Elio Loans, which is Yol Baal Shem, very, very famous author for many, and he writes Vikuach Hayayin im Hamayim. This is a disputation between wine and water. Who has caused more damage to the world, the water or the wine? And they go back and forth in a disputation, and they end up making peace. But the mashal goes to, as you're saying, it uses as a fable to show, the water and the wine. Each time he says, the wine tells the water says the wine is the source of all suffering because of, he says one of the things he says, because time of Haman, time of Achashverosh, they went and they drank wine and they were punished by the Suda. And the water says, and the wine tells the water, Then this wine says Moshe Rabbeinu was published by the water from the rock. I mean, you get back and forth. There's many more things over there that go on. So, you have a short summary of this one for those that want to check that out. That was actually interesting also because, as you note, that Goldman, who was the famous book dealer and helped him out, he actually published for one of his children's weddings, he actually published an edition of this work, which I thought was interesting.
Well, which is probably the book that he then afterwards sold to Lindsay.
Exactly.
There was nothing wrong with. I remember that. So it's a but this. So what happened actually is that Goldman got fascinated by the genre, and he had a good client for it. So it worked in both directions. And but what I appreciate about the way that Lynchett went about this is that he really had an open mind to discussing certain genre, to discussing the genre. And can this be considered a fable? Can this not be considered a fable? One of the things that we to give you a sense of how he collected, he feels that there is he feels that one of the the earliest fable in the Bible is Bileam, and it is a stretch. It is a stretch to consider it a fable, but we have republished the article by David Dobie, an inaugural lecture of the Oxford Center for Postgraduate Hebrew Studies. We reprinted it in a book on ancient Hebrew fables, and Dobie argues that it is a fable, and Lynchett decided on the basis of that to buy a couple of very early editions of Tanakh, including a medieval Sefer Torah. So he says, so he buys an entire Sefer Torah for the presence of one fable. And he says, okay, I'm the private collector. I can decide whatever I want. For me, this is a fable. I believe Dobie. Dobie was not believed by everybody. The majority of scholars will reject the notion that this is a fable. But he says it's a fable. So what should I do? Should I tell him no, it isn't? No, what I did, and he gave me an open. He really gave me all the space that I needed. Simply discuss the problematics of the issue, and respect the different positions, and that's what I did in the book. But there are a couple of instances later on for smaller books where I told him, listen, this is just a book about animals, and it doesn't have a moral content. But if the moral is what defines the fable, Bileam is also about morality. So I can see why if you stretch the definition, why would you not accept it?
Yeah, and your, like you said, 10-page introduction, you talk about the definition, something we discussed early on. This is very important when discussing this. But it's really a large collection of mashal-related, mishalim-related, fable-related, and there's really a lot of information for those interested, in the work. How many items are in the collection? So in the book, you have, I believe it's about 341 that are listed.
342, and the... and 300, and this is what is there. So he closed the collection when we closed the book, and he stopped buying when he closed the book. And the books were actually already in. The last time I saw the books, they were already in Cornell. So he moved them to Cornell. The truth of the matter is that I've been working on this book forever. I mean, I took it on in 1998, not knowing if I would have a career, and then I got a career, and it took me forever to finish it. So I did it together with Lies Meiboom, whose name I should mention because it's really a co-authored work. I mean, I took on the work and all the rough material that I had working with a number of scholars, especially in Amsterdam. The books have been in Amsterdam for 2 years as well. I mean, he sent all of the books to Amsterdam in the beginning of the century, and then back to Cleveland or back to Hunting Valley. And she was actually, Lies Meiboom was actually the one who she's also the senior editor of the Encyclopedia of Jewish Book Cultures, which I'm also editing. She is my associate editor, and we work together on this. And without her involvement, this would probably still be a wonderful idea. And she pushed it towards publication.
So the Jewish fables in this collection are in Hebrew, Yiddish. Do you have things in Ladino, other languages as well, or is it mainly Hebrew and Yiddish?
No, we have 14 languages in the book. You have Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Arabic. There's certain non-Jewish scholars are dealing with it. There's material in German. There's material in Dutch. There's material in. We see what else do we have? I think there's some material in Arabic as well. I think we have a total of 14 languages. There's material in Latin, and all of that is connected to the Jewish content. So the interesting thing is that the book contains traditional Jewish literature that happens to have fables. It contains medieval literature that is really largely about fables. It contains scholarly works that deal with fables. Because that's a totally different thing. The majority of some of the modern books, like actually modern books that deal with fables, or in which fables pop up just one way or the other, and they continue to be popular. I mean, there's still in Yiddish. I must say that in Yiddish there is a continuation of interest in fables, but as a literary genre. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that they're still part of teaching. But if you go to the to Amherst, to the Yiddish Book Center, and you go online and check for fables in that collection, you check for our authors, you will see that, especially from the later period, there are a lot of books that he did not collect. So there was a lot more. So it was an unbelievably popular genre over the centuries, and it's well, I'm happy actually that John Lindsay was the person who pushed me there, because I would never have studied this topic otherwise. One of the few scholars. I mean, it's being discussed in largely, I would say, in the context of studying Jewish folklore and studying Jewish folk literature. But many of the works that we're dealing with are actually high quality literary works, and also Midrash. There's a good article by David Stern there. Also in Talmud and Midrash. I mean, they are part of the literary makeup of Talmud. They're part of the literary makeup of the Midrash.
Yeah, many of these even have measures. One we didn't mention, Chibur Yafa Mea Yeshua, famous work about Reb Nisim of Keron. That's a work that contains Mashalim. It has some Mashalim from Midrashim. Those may be familiar with that work. That's been reprinted. That's actually still in print. That was reprinted. Like some of these works are definitely still in print. Can you go to the bookstore today and buy a Mashalak and Moini or Ben Amelach Van Nozir? Mishle Shualim, I'm not sure. Actually, Chabriyav Me'ashu, you can. I mean, some of them you can. Again, how popular they are, not as much anymore. But that in general is about many works, as you know, from the medieval period, or works that were familiar, very popular. One that comes from Bechinas Olam of Adir, it's not around there. No one reads that anymore. And it was printed dozens of times. But that happens. Things change, interests change. But you really see. What this showed me, what I saw is, first of all, it's very nice, like you say, Jewish folklore, Jewish fables connected to Jewish folklore, but it's collected in one place, and you can see kind of the interest over the centuries and the number of times these things were printed and reprinted and rehashed and reshaped and how popular they really were. And you look at this, you're like, oh wow, look at that. This is how popular they really were. And he says, as a teaching tool, as a learning tool, as whatever it is.
But also as a political tool. I mean, in the Haskalah period, and also later on in the Emancipation period, there's a lot of political criticism, either on the latitude on the part of those who wanted to assimilate, or on the other way, or the other way around, on for example, the fables that I don't have it available now, but the fables that comment the notion of Pilpul and say Pilpul is going overboard, and we're way too critical. So there's a lot going on there. So a lot of it can also be very, very political, actually, and have all kinds of comments on the on the behavior of the elites. And then later on in the 20th century, you have the likes of Steinbach and a couple of the very important fable poets or fable writers whose fame actually rests on the notion that they wrote fables, like you have La Fontaine and in French literature and Krylov in Russian literature. So it became a genre. It became a genre under the influence of the usually of the surrounding culture, but they are very useful for teaching. And they trigger the imagination, and people want to use their imagination.
Yeah, for those interested in this, really, the book is really nice because you have a selection throughout. You can check through and you can look at the different ones. And you see the styles changing when you look at the medieval period, and then you look at the Haskalah era, and you see what they're talking about. You can kind of see that. So I'll link to the book. The book's around $115. It's not a bit pricey, the book, for those interested in it. I think once in a while maybe it goes on sale on Amazon. But
maybe it's available on Amazon. If I'm not wrong, I think it's also available digitally on the website of Cornell. I mean, we could try and look up the link. Maybe we can put the link in the.
Yeah, I can link to Cornell as well. I can link to Cornell. I can link to Amazon for those interested in purchasing it there. And just one question at the end, because just for you, is that you worked on this, and then you work in the Perkinsky collection, work on others, and then you work as a. What goes into that, generally speaking, like for the listeners to understand? And as you mentioned here, this is not strictly a bibliography, because you actually go and you translate some of the fables, which again was an excellent idea because it gives you some more information and background besides the articles and the information in the beginning of the book. But what goes into when you're cataloging a collection? You said it took you decades. What goes into that cataloging it? And is each collection unique? But in general, the general work when you're given a collection, you say, here, catalog this, create a bibliography, a catalog. What goes into that?
Well, I think the most of the work that we put into it in the first couple of years actually was defining what are we going to describe and what are we not going to describe. So I was also involved in writing an enormous amount of descriptions for catalogs that were done in the let's say in the 1990s by Christie's Amsterdam, Christie's London, and Christie's New York. So I was one of the anonymous catalogers in back of those auction catalogs. And in auction cataloging, it's all about the condition. So you describe a book, you count the pages, and if one page is missing, it has a big influence on the price of the book. So the commercial description of books, and that's the majority of descriptions that are made for commerce. Commercial description for books is about condition. The bibliographical description of books is about the establishment. So let's say the hardcore bibliography is about the establishment of an ideal copy. So what did the book look like when it left the press? But this is a description of one particular copy in this one particular collection. And for me, having to go over the threshold, not of describing the physical object, but of diving into the content and diving in just the isolating fables in 200-page works. I mean, you can imagine what that means. And oftentimes it was described when it was sold to him, but oftentimes it wasn't. So we had to re-identify the fable content of a particular book. Or if a dealer says, I found 2 fables and there are 5, I cannot write that there were 2. So we had to go through all the books. And so there's a lot more involved than just the physical description of the books. They're very important books, but many of the books are not necessarily the most expensive books that some of them are actually, but many of them are not necessarily the most expensive that I work with for other collections or that I work with for Christie's in the past. I mean, we're not talking. I mean, I've been working a lot on Megillot and Ketubot. I'm working a lot on 18th century manuscript with illustrations, decorated, illuminated medieval manuscripts. It's a totally different line of work. And so it's hardcore bibliography, but at the end of the day, it's about defining defining why this book belongs in this collection, and that is different from everything else that I've been doing until now.
Yeah, as you say, sometimes you have to really find what it was, and if you look at like in the Haskalah when he had like the journals, it's like Hama Asif, and you would have to find like what fable was in that one. Sometimes you had Fox in the Grapes, was a fox who can't reach the grapes, and he decides to bid her anyway. He's not going to do it. One of them contains the fable of the worm in the cheese, which is the worm crawling around in the cheese, and then you can read all about the worm in the cheese fable.
Asif, I was greatly helped by Moshe Pelly. Moshe Pelly, American scholar, and Pelly did a bibliography of Maasev and a discussion of Maasev and also an index of Maasev. So identifying those in Maasev was easier than most of the others because of his work. And I actually discussed the Maasev a lot with him, and also the fable content of the word a lot with him over these many years. And I'm also very grateful to John Linsage simply for, how shall I put it, being as nice as he was about me taking forever to publish this. I mean, I've been publishing 15 books in the meantime, so but it was very complicated, and I was very happy that he forked out the money to do the beautiful book that it became. So that's another thing that is very important.
Right, and again, it's the range of the collection is fascinating as well. For example, just to give one other example, you also have the Shalosh Tshuvas HaGa'onim, which was a work published in various places, but the one in Greece in 1802. And why is it Shalosh Tshuvas? What is this doing here? Well, it's here because there's a responsa of Rav Hai Gaon, I think it's Rav Hai Gaon, where he says, he's quoting the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Rebbecha said, Rameir said there's 300 fox fables, we only 3 left. And then he goes on, you have this in English, know that these fables contain a great amount of wisdom and ethical teachings told as if by animals. For example, the book of the members of the caste system called Kalila and Dimna, in which there are animal fables and wise sayings, all those fables are based on scriptural verses, is what it says. The Indians also tell a tale which a fox is met by a lion who wishes to kill him. Said the fox to the lion, "What have I got on my bones which I can possibly satisfy you? Come with me and I'll show you a fat man who you enjoy eating up." The fox showed him a man who was sitting in front of a covered hole. When the lion saw the man, he was afraid to pounce on him. "You have nothing to fear," said the fox. Of course the lion pounced, but fell in the hole. "I thought you told me that I have nothing to fear about this man," said the lion to the fox when down in the hole. "Yes," said the fox, "but your grandfather did have what to fear, and it is on you that the punishment has fallen. Said the lion to the fox, "Parents have eaten sour grapes, and children's teeth are blunted." Quoting Yirmiyah, "Well, you should have thought of that earlier," retorted the fox. They are, so Rav Hai Gaon finishes, so many and various beats of ethical truths in this story, and others like it. So because of this small, just because of, first of all, it's fascinating, but just because of this small mashal, he bought this volume of Shalosh Teshuvos, and it ended up in this collection.
Exactly. That's exactly how it is. And this is the whole point of, and this is why it's such a unique collection. And it's not going to happen again. And that's so that is what has continued to fascinate me. And there have been moments in which I thought I'm ever going to be able to do it. So then the point at which we decided to co-author it became a book again. But no, it is the work of one man who had the vision to bring this together simply through his fascination. It's about fascination, the personal fascination of a collector.
Okay, so the book's about 565 pages, 100 pages or so of introductory material and articles, and then there's the extensive bibliography, and hopefully we gave you some sort of a feeling of that. There is more material than just, okay, I'm just reading a catalog. No, there's actually, you can get samples, you can get interesting material out of it, you can get translated selections. So again, that was a great idea, whoever you mentioned whose idea that was earlier. So I'll link to the book in the show notes, and thank you, Professor Schrijver, for joining me once again on the podcast.
My pleasure. My pleasure.